Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Yay! We are so excited to be here in historic Gaston Hall in person again, finally, and to welcome over 1,700 of you who are joining us online. We're also delighted that C-SPAN is covering this conversation, and we want to welcome our C-SPAN audience as well. There are so many of you joining us here today in person. There's one person who you might have noticed is not here with us. It's the person whose idea this was, who worked hardest on it of anybody, and who was so excited to be here tonight. And of course, that's my colleague, John Carr. Our initiative team was looking forward to being together in person for the first time in a long time, and of course, to our first in-person dialogue in 2 years, but COVID won't let go easily. John tested positive over the weekend. And I know his symptoms are mild and they're improving, so we're all good, but he's so disappointed not to be here with us, and we're so disappointed that he can't be here with us. We know you're watching from home, John. We miss you. We're glad to know that you're getting better, and no, you can't email me questions for the panel during our conversation. I promise I'll call you later. This is very much what the last 2 years have been like, though, isn't it? And of course, it's a reminder that so many have been through so much more and that COVID isn't over yet. But now let's look back to the beginning for a minute. So much has happened since that night 2 years ago when we all felt the shutdown happen. First of all, of course, a global pandemic with over almost 1 million lives lost here in the United States alone. Lockdowns, closed schools, closed churches, conflicts over vaccines and mask mandates. And of course, we can't even start our conversation without talking about the ongoing invasion of Ukraine, causing enormous suffering and loss of life for the people of Ukraine as they stand firm against this unjust aggressor. We've had 2 presidential impeachments. We've had 1 election. We've had a violent attack on the US Capitol. We've had the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. We've had continuing anguish in the wake of the clergy sexual abuse crisis. We've had police killings of Black people on our streets and on our screens. We've had a reckoning with racial injustice in our hearts. We've looked at Pope Francis' moral leadership and think about where he's been during this time, to Iraq, to Lesbos. He's written Fratelli Tutti, an important papal encyclical. And he's called a global synod to listen to and learn from lay people around the world about where we should go as a church in this particular time and in our own particular places. So what most stands out for me about Pope Francis' leadership during this time is what I think will surely be remembered as one of the iconic images of his papacy and really of these times. It was 2 years ago, almost to the day, on March 27th, 2020. And so picture it, Pope Francis, the 85-year-old leader of some 1.3 billion Catholics around the world, standing alone at night in a steady rain in a deserted St. Peter's Square, right? Remember that? He had the Basilica behind him. He had Bernini's colonnade all around him. He had an icon of Mary and a miraculous crucifix by his side. And that cold night, he delivered an extraordinary message and an extraordinary address to the church and the world in response to the coronavirus crisis that was then unfolding. And here's one thing he said. He said, we must go forward together, unafraid. He called for new forms of hospitality and fraternity and solidarity. And he said that the Lord asks us in the midst of our tempest to put into practice that solidarity and hope capable of giving strength, support, and meaning to those hours when everything seems to be floundering. That powerful call to solidarity and hope rang out in a frightened world. So here at the Initiative, we tried to respond in our own small way to Pope Francis' call by, among other things, offering 45 online dialogues on COVID-19, faith and politics, racism, human life and dignity, and other issues, reaching over 150,000 viewers over these last 2 years across the country and beyond. We worked to go broader and deeper and reach more people. And we were able to lift up diverse voices, with over half of our panelists being women and over half being people of color. And even though we know we, of course, have so much more work to do on that, we're heartened to know that there's a hunger for the kind of principled dialogue that we offer, for the moral vocabulary of Catholic social teaching. But we, of course, miss being together. We miss seeing all of you. We missed old friends, and we miss making new ones. So this evening is a new beginning for us. It combines our online reach with gathering in person with those of our community who can be here with us tonight and who can join us in this historic hall and over food and drinks later. And as to that, we might not have predicted this polar vortex outside, but you'll be happy to know that we've been able to move the reception inside, so we'll all be able to get together later on in some warmth. But most of all tonight, we wanted to look back at what we've been through, look around at the challenges we face right now, and look ahead to where we should go. And to do this, we've assembled an all-star team from our dialogues. First, of course, we have David Brooks. He's a columnist for the New York Times on politics, policy, and culture. He's a PBS NewsHour commentator as well. And he's the author of The Second Mountain, The Quest for a Moral Life. We have E.J. Dionne, a columnist at The Washington Post, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and a professor here at Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy. E.J.'s the author of numerous books, the latest of which is 100% Democracy. Here it is. The Case for Universal Voting, and he wrote about it in the Post just this weekend. We have Christine Emba. Where is Christine? Over here. Christine Emba, who's an opinion columnist on ideas and society and an editor at the Washington Post. Christine also has a new book out. It's called Rethinking Sex, A Provocation, and it's great. I encourage you to read it. Mirka Sosa here is a third-year student at Georgetown who studies government and Spanish. Mirka was nominated by President DeGioia and selected as a Campus Compact Newman Civic Fellow for her work with immigrants and the Latino community. And we're so glad she's here with us tonight. And finally, Ann Thompson, who is an award-winning reporter with NBC, covering many issues, including the environment, COVID-19, Pope Francis, and the Catholic Church. And she's a graduate of another Catholic school in an even colder place, Notre Dame. And so as we get started here tonight, just a reminder, to those of you joining us online, please give us your thoughts on social media at the hashtag #SoWhatDidIMiss, and by tagging us at GUCST Public Life. And for those of you here at Georgetown, we'll have time for questions and answers later on. And so now let's get started with our roundtable. And Mirka, I want to turn to you first. You're a third-year student here at Georgetown. You're a student government leader. You do so much work coordinating volunteer opportunities for Georgetown students in the migrant community here in DC, and you grew up in Texas. So you have a unique perspective here, and we wanted to be sure to highlight that right off the bat. You've been living through the pandemic as a college student in various different communities with your friends, with your family. Looking back at these past 2 years, this long, tough 2 years, what do you believe is the most important moment or development related to COVID or faith or politics, and what did it reveal about us and about our nation? What has it been like for you and your friends and your family?
Yeah, so I think that the pandemic really caused a series of events that really revealed injustices and inequities among our society, but even among different communities. So these inequities were very existent before, but I think they were also amplified. And we can see that in circumstances where some people were gaining wealth and privilege while others were losing it. I remember in March 2020, right when the lockdown was about to start, I was in an alternative breaks program. So my school provides a program in which we're able to go for a week to somewhere and explore a certain issue. I went to Nogales, Arizona with a group of students, and during that time the Remain in Mexico policy was put into place, in which migrants who were seeking asylum were all placed in Mexico, and many were placed in detention centers in a condensed area. I had a very extensive conversation with a Border Patrol agent in which I asked what precautions were being taken and how they were preparing for this ongoing pandemic, and I was given a very unclear answer. And during that time as well, Title 42, which is a policy denying asylum to people because of the pandemic, was also passed. And this all just shows how our country was just not prepared, and the humanity and the livelihood of many people was just forgotten. Another thing, in DC, like in other cities, gentrification did not stop during the pandemic. A lot of people were laid off, and with increasing rent prices, a lot of people lost their homes. And in terms of public health as well, a lot of the information was not translated for our migrant communities. I remember I was the one translating a lot of the information about vaccines and COVID tests for my family. And here in an area that claims to be very migrant friendly, DC, and has a lot of laws about language accessibility. We did have flyers that were accessible, and some were translated, but they were referred to the CDC website, which also did not have translation. And I am a low-income student, so I faced a lot of inaccessibility to reliable internet during the year we had on Zoom. And a lot of the circumstances going on in my own home, I saw with the students that we tutor through DC Schools Project, which is a program I'm involved in, which provides English language literacy tutoring to migrant youth. And I remember sharing the same internet source with my two younger sisters, who were at the time 8th grade and kindergarten. And there was obviously a lot of background noise in our homes. The internet was spotty, and I saw the same thing when our tutors were trying to tutor the students. And I think during that year, a lot of low-income students just fell behind in terms of curriculum, not only in grade school, but also in college. And we could see how there were just a lot of disparities in who could afford to attain education.
Thanks for that. That really laid out so eloquently so many of the disparities, I think, that we've seen during this time. So thanks so much for that, Mirka. I want to turn to you now, David. You've written so much during this time, during COVID, and I want to know, you were on our first panel, our first online dialogue, right after this all started. And you've written about the crisis of solidarity. You've written about the challenges facing our democracy. What do you see when you look back at this time as the most important developments, the most important factors we face?
I see awesome change. 2 years ago, E.J. Dionne and I were sitting in rooms in Georgetown talking about Dorothy Day and the Boston Red Sox and bitter politics. And now we're back talking about Dorothy Day, George. So I guess nothing's really changed. I guess, to me, the most important thing that has happened over the last 20 years, which has been accelerated by COVID, has been a slow motion social, emotional, and psychological crisis in this country. And it's measurable in the data, 33% rise in suicide, 40 or 50% rise in depression rates. 45% of college students say they have endured periods of such stress that they could not function. 54% of Americans say no one knows them well. The number of people who say they have no close friends has quadrupled. And so this is a period of social pain that has been building really for the last 20 years. And then COVID sent it into overdrive. And so in 2020, in late 2020, Americans registered their lowest level of well-being in American history, or since they've been measuring this stuff. And so that, we cover politics and other things, but underlying a lot of the turmoil and bitterness and hatred is really a slow motion social crisis underlying the opioid addictions. And so there's just a lot of sadness, and there's a lot of isolation. And sadness often, for some people, leads to bitterness, because the feeling of isolation is a feeling of being rejected and being humiliated. And there's an urge to want to humiliate the people you think are humiliating you. And there's a great Anton Chekhov a short story called Enemies. It's about two guys who suffered grievous loss on the same day. One lost his son, the other lost his wife. And you'd think they'd be in solidarity and suffering, but they hate each other because there's social inequality between them. And so that's, I think, the emotional undertone of a lot of what we see. And as Hannah Arendt wrote years ago, when you take lonely people, they are susceptible to the pull of authoritarianism, because authoritarians tell humiliation stories. You've been betrayed. They say you can partake in my strong leadership and feel significant. You can lose yourself in the mass. And so what starts out as a psychological problem turns into a national problem. And so the bitterness that we've seen the last few years, and a lot of the anguish and anger, I think flows from pretty deep psychological and ultimately spiritual roots. And that's something that, if we can't talk about it here at Georgetown, where can we talk about it?
Fair enough. Christine, that's a great setup for you. I mean, you've spent the past 2 years, really writing about relationships, writing about people and how they can do right by each other. What do you think has been the most important development, the most important factor over the past 2 years in the pandemic?
Yeah, that was actually a perfect setup. Thank you, David. I think that the most fundamental shift that I've seen, or hopeful shift that I've seen rather, is a renewed understanding of our interdependence. There is loneliness, and within that loneliness, we see reason to relate to each other, to care for each other more. And we're asking ourselves whether we can do that better going forward. So on a policy level, early on in the pandemic, the COVID crisis was seen as a shock that no one could have anticipated. And so on a sort of governmental level, we moved away from our normal ideal of liberal individualism and bootstrapping, that everybody has to fix their problems themselves. And we rallied. We passed a child tax credit, extended unemployment insurance, student loan forbearance, these COVID relief checks. And we found that our government had capacity. We also found that we had the capacity to help each other. And that lifted 8 million children out of poverty. That amounted to economic stability for the first time for so many families. And today, we're on the brink of the great expiration of all of these programs. And we're talking about what it will look like to return to normal. Normal, though, of course, is a return to this disconnection, these lower levels of support, these rather shredded social safety net. And we're asking ourselves, do we want that normal again? And I think this is one of the first, major times we've asked that question in, I think, recent history. And then on a personal level, Kim, as you said, I spent much of the pandemic interviewing, researching, and writing for my book, Rethinking Sex, which is about, well, first of all, the malaise that many are feeling in our sexual culture, especially young people, and also then what a better sexual culture would look like. How we can care for each other, not just on the base level of consent, but on an ethical level, a moral level. What do we owe to each other, and what do we actually want? And talking to young people especially, I think that the pandemic lockdown early on gave us time to think. So many people were finally perhaps working from home, were not able to swipe on Tinder and find a new date every night. We're realizing what it looks like to, be alone, and what it would look like instead to have had a real partnership, a family, someone to care for them, to be responsible for them and be responsible too. And many people realized that they wanted that. They wanted that sense of care. They wanted that sense of love. And now, with this pause, people are asking, what should I do to get there going forward? Again, this is a question of remembering what the old normal looked like and reconsidering whether that's actually what we want. And I think that's a hopeful thing, actually. Of course, we'll have to see where it goes.
I think it's hopeful too, but you're right. And we've heard a lot already. We've heard about the inequalities that have been revealed. We've heard about the crisis of isolation. We've heard about the need for interdependence. What do you think is the most important moment or development over these past 2 years?
I just want to give a big shout out to science, because science is why we're here.
Yes.
And vaccines are why we're all here. And this is an extraordinary accomplishment. If you remember, think about this. Within a month of COVID-19 being discovered in Wuhan, they released the genetic sequence for the disease. Within a year of that, not one, not two, but 3 pharmaceutical companies in this country had developed vaccines that made it possible for the death rate to decrease dramatically, for the serious hospitalization rate to decrease dramatically, for the fact that we are now here and we can gather again. And what a phenomenal accomplishment that is. But as we all know, the issue of vaccines have revealed the great divide in this country as well. Today, still, I think it's 23% of Americans are unvaccinated, haven't gotten any shot. And what stuns me about that is that I think it stems from the deterioration in trust and authority in our institutions that we have seen crumble in the last several years. And when you talk to people, when I talk to people who've chosen not to get the vaccine, what they talk about is not, they don't look at the science, they don't look at the majority of us who are part of this great science experiment. What they talk about is that they heard second or third hand or found it on the internet that somebody died quickly after getting the vaccine. And they're not asking questions about comorbidities or anything like that, but they're holding on to that like it's the gospel truth. And they can't get rid of it. And even within the Catholic faith, we've seen this divide. Pope Francis got the vaccine, Pope Emeritus Benedict got the vaccine. The Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith says the vaccines are morally acceptable, and yet there are still Catholics who will not get the vaccines because they say the fact that the development and the production of these vaccines stem in part from a cell line that came from an aborted fetus 50 years ago is reason for them not to get it. Even though Pope Francis has said the vaccines are an act of love. This is what you do not only just to protect yourself, but to protect everyone around us. And so while I think I'm so thrilled for the vaccine, I practically hugged my nurse when I got my shot. And I asked her, I said, do people have that reaction? She said, you would be amazed at how many people want to hug me. And that was back when you couldn't hug people. I think it is also laid bare this divide that not only separates us on science, separates us on politics, separates us as a nation and as a faith community.
Well, EJ, in many ways, that's a perfect setup for you, too, because you write so much about the common good. You write so much about the divisions in this country. What do you think about this, sort of looking back, the most important moment or development that we've seen over the past 2 years?
Well, we have reached that point in a panel discussion where everything has been said, but not everyone has said it yet. And I just want to make a point. I am so happy to be here with a lot of old friends. And I know Christine is my former editor. She has written a book about sex. I have written a book about democracy and voting systems. Which of these books do you think has a better chance of making the bestseller list? So congratulations to Christine. And we miss you, John Carr, but we're very grateful to Kim. 3 of the points, I was going to do 7 points in 4 minutes, and I still will, but 3 of them have already been touched on. The first point Mirka started with, and I think it's really important to think a lot more about the radical differences across class and professional lines in how this pandemic affected Americans. If you had certain kinds of jobs, you could work at home, you could work on Zoom, you could actually, if you were in the investment world, you ended up richer at the end of the pandemic than you were at the beginning. But if you were an essential worker, have we forgotten about the essential workers? I think we have. If you were in a slaughterhouse or did deliveries, and everybody across the entire health system, you had a very different kind of pandemic. And I think that lesson should be a lesson that sticks with us and should affect our thinking about policy more than it has. Second one goes to Ann's point. The good news is we produced a vaccine in record time. That is really astonishing, and a lot of us are so grateful. The bad news, as she also pointed out, was that irrational political divisions around vaccination and masking probably cost us a lot of lives. I was very little when the polio epidemic happened, and I don't remember this myself, but I remember the extraordinary appreciation for Dr. Salk and the vaccine that ended polio. We did not have these kinds of divisions then. This is something we should think about. Good news, we held an election in the middle of a pandemic and had the highest turnout in American history. If you think back, at a moment when everybody was included in the electorate, we thought that voting in a pandemic was going to be dangerous, that turnout was going to drop. And all across the country, red states, blue states, we made adjustments to make it easier for people to vote. I am still very proud that I cast my ballot in a drop box in front of Walt Whitman High School, which was A, where my kids went to school, but B, he's the poet of democracy. So I felt very good about dropping that ballot in there. The bad news is that in many places we're rolling back those advances. And those advances will help Republicans vote and Democrats vote and independents vote. And what is that about? Why can't we continue to build on those advances to include everyone? Good news, poverty actually fell during the pandemic. Poverty fell because government acted and because we gave up a purely ideological view, oh, gee, you're pro-government or anti-government. And again, this is the point Christine raised. And we did all sorts of things to keep the economy from collapsing and lifting up people, especially the poor. The effects of the child tax credit was just extraordinary. The bad news is that we're backing up from that. We're not looking at what things we did during the pandemic that might actually help us in good times. And by the way, I can't resist noting that we had an unalloyed experiment in pure socialized medicine. Every person got vaccinated for free, and it actually worked. Just something to think about. The next point is, and we could talk the whole time about this, good news, we had a racial reckoning, and we really started thinking about questions that we had kind of pushed aside. Bad news, about a year later, we have a racial backlash, a backlash against the reckoning. Now, that's not uncommon in our history, but when you have a reckoning and then you have a backlash, you got to think, where is this going to end? Is the reckoning going to win or is the backlash going to win? We are still in the middle of this. Two other points. We learned that we can work differently in at least many of our lines of work. Think about how much less carbon we pumped into the atmosphere because people didn't have to commute everywhere. I think we do not want to go back to exactly the way we were. I think we want to learn some lessons in how we organized work. And again, recognizing that not every job could be reorganized and this could not benefit everyone. But we made some real progress in how work and family might get balanced in this period. I hope we stick with that. Lastly, I have spent 25 years, I think, in dialogue with my dear friend, David Brooks. And normally, I'm the guy who points out all the problems, and David has been more optimistic. I'm going to flip on this for a moment. I actually agree with much of what David said. Unfortunately, I often do. But I want to sort of go a little more where Christine did on this question of who we are as people. I really do think that the loneliness and suffering of the pandemic also made us realize the importance of friendship, solidarity, and community. And I know a lot of people, I know it had this effect on me, and I think it had the effect on a lot of people, reached out more than ever to friends, reached out to people you hadn't touched in a while, in some cases, reached out to people you cared about and knew were in trouble, and you couldn't see them, you couldn't go see them face to face, but you knew they needed a hand, or at least needed to hear a voice of somebody they loved and somebody who cared about them. I think that we have realized even more than we ever did how important relationships are, and that will only increase the readership of David Brooks' columns. Thank you.
Well, Mirka, what's your reaction to all this? Let's now kind of talk about where we are right now in our communities and where maybe what's happened with your friendships, with your communities. Where are they right now? What do you see in your work?
Yeah, so I think in my work, I have seen that we have started a process of healing. However, I think that healing has been prolonged due to the lack of support for our communities, not only from the government, but also from like different systems of power. So I will talk upon my own personal experience. Last semester, through my minors program, I'm an education minor, I volunteered in a first grade classroom at a DC public school. And this classroom followed a dual immersion program. And half of the day was taught in Spanish, half of the day was taught in English. The classroom was mixed in terms of language acquisition. And so you had students who did not speak any English, you had students who did not speak any Spanish, and you had students that were fluent in both. And I saw a lot of disparities in terms of education acquisition, unsurprisingly, given the different circumstances people went through the year that we were all online. And these trends kind of followed income levels. So the students that were ahead were higher income, the students who were behind were lower income. And I remember having a lot of conversations with my host teacher. She was constantly stressed and frustrated because she had to give her students a lot of standardized tests, and if they didn't reach a certain goal, she would be the one facing the consequences. And not only did she have a lot of 7, 8-year-olds in a classroom, but sometimes she had students online. So she had to deal with so much responsibility, and she was just not granted any support. And one thing that I'm constantly thinking about is how these students will eventually go to middle and high school. The students who are ahead right now will go to honors courses, and the students who are behind will not. The students in honors courses will probably get college prep, essentially go on to acquiring a higher education and such. And the students who were not, in terms of tracking, will be forgotten. And I think this is something very important to think about, because not only does it perpetuate a cycle of education acquisition, but also a cycle of poverty. And in the tutoring program I work in, we unfortunately lost many students because for different reasons. Some lost their phone numbers and had to get new ones because of the lack or inability to pay for their phone line. Others had to move out of District of Columbia because of that gentrification I was talking about and inability of pay rent. And right now, like many other programs, we are trying to recruit students. We have been in contact with our community partners, different schools, to provide that resource, but right now we just have a resource that's sometimes not being used. And I think that's also a symptom of the pandemic, even though it's a small part of everything. It just shows how we are still dealing with a lot of the circumstances that were caused because of this disease.
Thanks so much for that. And one of the things that I take away from what you've just said is I just think about our teachers during this time and what they've gone through, right? I mean, it's just amazing. And to have tried to adjust, to think about that, 2 languages, online, in person. And I think we really owe them a debt of gratitude as well. So thank you, Mirka. David, I want to turn to you now. What's going on right now? We have a polarized politics here in this country. We have an invasion of Ukraine. What do you think is the most important thing for us to look at right now?
Well, I'm uncharacteristically the prophet of doom, but I'm sticking with the doom. In the beginning of COVID, I was going to write this big 10,000-word piece for The Atlantic on how we all came together in time of COVID. And I was gathering all the evidence, and I was trying to argue against the evidence. And finally, I got bowled over by the evidence. And we just didn't come together. And even today, if you look at a lot of social indicators about good behavior, I agree with Christine. We value friendships, we value relationships. We just don't seem to be very good at it. And so, relationships is what we care about most. We seem to stink at it for reasons I have theories about. But you just look at the social indicators, the murder rates are surging. Gun purchases, January 21 versus January 2020, gun purchases were up 80%. School discipline, the number of disruptive incidents in schools now is 3 times higher than before COVID. Hate crimes have hit a 12-year high. Reckless driving has gotten so bad that even as the number of miles driven has plummeted, the number of highway deaths is up. Death threats have become a normal thing in our business. I just had lunch yesterday with a buddy of mine who's running COVID relief in California, or a region of California. He got his home firebombed when his kids were living there at 4 a.m. after just tons of death threats. I was with a guy who owns a restaurant in New York last week. He said, now on a weekly basis, I have to kick people out. I have to ban people from the restaurant for rude and entitled behavior. And there's just a lot of that going on. And so I think somehow we have to face up to that fact. And what do we do about it? I'm not sure there's a political solution to what is basically a social and moral problem. And in Christine's excellent book, we talked about this the other day, that the interview saddened me because I felt a lot of especially the young women you spoke with, had not been given a basic fundamentals on how to think morally about sex. Like how to feel when you should have sex, when it's going to be spiritually fulfilling to have sex. And Catholic social teaching gives us this long tradition on all things I've talked about. And I feel like that just hasn't been passed on. And so, I come back to this David Foster Wallace quote that he says he committed suicide a few years ago, but before he said, I feel a sense of lostness that my generation has had a moral inheritance of practically nothing. And I'm really not the doom and gloom guy normally. I'm known around the Times as the completely unrealistic optimist. But I do think that a lot of things we come in this room to talk about and that your organization talks about, which are really about moral formation. Somehow we've gotten out of the business of moral formation. And, I teach at Yale, and Yale used to be about raising men and women of character. We don't talk about that anymore. Now it's how to get a PhD or whatever. And so there's been a bit of a moral vacuum, especially in the way we form the young. And I think that has contributed to all the different numbers I've reeled off here.
That's a sobering report for sure. And here at Georgetown, we talk about being men and women for others. And I wonder, Christine, if that might factor into what you see when you look right now at where we are now and your reaction to what you've heard so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I wasn't going to try and make this an opportunity to just talk about my book, but David is forcing me / giving me the opportunity. One of the first chapters in my book is titled "We're Liberated, but We're Miserable." And it talks about how, sort of post-sexual revolution and post-feminist movement, we've been given this impression that, especially as young people, we're free. We're free to have as much sex as we want, meet as many people as we want, do what we want. And that theoretically should make us happier. But instead we're seeing in our sexual culture this, again, malaise. No one actually feels that much happier. In fact, many people feel very lost. And moreover, when bad things happen, when there are sexual assaults or even sexual encounters that are ostensibly consented to, but are sad, depressing, even traumatic, there's no recourse. There's no way to talk about what the problem is. And yes, that is a lack of moral formation. There's an emptiness in that sort of liberation. And I think we're actually seeing that on a broader scale, and that's kind of a conflict that we're fighting right now in this moment. When it comes to COVID, we're sort of arguing over what freedom really means, what our country's definition of freedom is. You see a lot of people saying, well, freedom actually means that I don't have to care about you anymore, that I don't have a responsibility to you. I'm free to not wear a mask. I'm free to not get vaccinated because it's my choice and I don't have to be accountable to you. My freedom means the freedom not to care about anyone else. At the same time, the pandemic, I think, should have taught us, in fact, that we do owe things to each other, that we are responsible for each other, that our society, runs better when there is an ethic of care, when we actually understand a sort of moral imperative to wish the common good and to be part of it, even when it's an inconvenience or unpleasant to ourselves. And as we consider what going back to normal looks like, I think we really have to, get to the basis of that question. What is freedom? What is good? How do we teach people to care for each other? How do we make that care manifest and visible in society, in our personal relationships, including the sexual ones that I write about in my book, but also as it relates to, the government allowing for a welfare state that helps people who are not us. When it comes to policy making policies that do, in fact, help perhaps the poor or people of other races. When it comes to racial reconciliation, talking about passing policies, acting in a way that's beneficial to, minority groups that we may not be a part of. And I really do think that there is a dawning realization that the sort of autonomy, loneliness, I don't have to care about anyone but myself, is harmful in the long run. That's what we've seen. But again, we're at a tipping point right now where we're told to go back to normal and we are just not sure what the new normal will be.
Thanks for that, Christine. Anne, just turning to you, we've talked a lot about social issues, and I wonder if you've been, you report on so many different things. And right now
Human spackle. That's what I call myself.
So what do you think? We look around, we have this war in Ukraine, we have this incredibly polarized society here, so many other challenges you're facing. When you look around right now, what catches your attention?
Well, I think that, not to be Susie Sunshine here, but if there is one good aspect of the war in Ukraine, it is that we still recognize evil, and most of us do, and we are appalled by it. And that gives me great hope. It also gives me great concern about what we're doing or not doing. But I think that the fact that as a country, on both sides of the aisle, that we recognize that what has happened in Ukraine is wrong, is evil, is far closer to 1939 than anything we've seen in our lifetime, is a good thing. However, I am very discouraged by having watched the confirmation hearings for Judge Brown Jackson last week, and watching this woman in particular being subjected to questions that have nothing to do with ruling on court cases. And we need, and I felt this way watching Justice Barrett's confirmation hearings too. We need to find a different way to do this, because these hearings shouldn't take place so that a senator gets a soundbite for a TV ad. I want to hear a discussion of judicial philosophy. I want to hear about what forms your thinking, how you confront problems, how you make decisions, instead of rating your faith on a scale of 1 to 10. I don't know anybody who rates their faith on a scale of 1 to 10. But listening to Christine, when you were talking about the fact that people are unhappy and they don't know how to make decisions, they have all this freedom, but they're not happy with it. I think some of that may have to do with the decline of organized religion in society, because while there are aspects of organized religion that you may disagree with, the one thing it does is it does give you a moral backdrop on which to live your life. And if you aren't exposed to that education, if you aren't exposed to those principles early in life, I would imagine it's got to be hard to go through life, to try to figure out what's right and what's wrong, to know that you need to care for someone else.
Thanks for that, Anne. EJ, let's turn to you. What's your reaction to this when you think about what's going on right now? Like, what catches your attention?
Well, I almost feel obligated to be a glass 1/10 full person after some of the gloom here, and I just want to underscore a couple of things Anne said that I so emphatically agree with. One is the hearing on Judge Jackson. Let's look very carefully at what happened. This is a judge who issued sentences in child pornography cases that basically look like those other judges, including Republican judges, had issued in child pornography cases. And after all those questions, there are going to be people out there who say this judge is soft on child porn, and it's a big lie. And that is what was presented at that hearing. And it was really depressing. And I do think, and I'm not going to harp on this today, but there is a kind of radicalization on the right end of the political spectrum that allowed that to happen. We can argue both parties have done this and that in confirmation hearings, and yeah, confirmation hearings are problematic across the board now, but I think something has happened on that side that we need to worry about. I also agree with you very much on the war in Ukraine, although there are still some people who won't give up on their love for Vladimir Putin inside our politics. But I do think the attack on Ukraine has reminded us of the importance of democracy and self-determination. And we haven't seen a feeling like this on a public issue in a very long time. So I think you are correct about that. The 1/10 full part of me I want to sort of express in two ways. Christine and David are both right about the discontent and the disorder or the unhappiness that they see. And I'm not disputing any of that. But I have to say, I have seen in my students, in a lot of young people, a kind of sense of determination about making the country more democratic, making the country more just, an anger about injustice that they actually want to do something about. And right now there's some disillusionment with public action, but there was a degree of engagement in the public sphere over the last few years that I think is really heartening. And I think it is connected to an ethic that also, again, quite consistent with Catholic social thought, that does link personal obligations with social obligations. I think those are out there as well. And then at the risk of being a vulgar materialist, I think we cannot overlook the deep material inequality in the country. And that when we look at what has happened to parts of the country, both in the inner city, ironically, we have deep racial divisions, and yet what's happened to many inner city, predominantly black neighborhoods from deindustrialization is exactly what's happened to an awful lot of white working class mill towns in the country because of economic change and deindustrialization. And we have not found either policies or a language to pull these two communities together, because both people living in both kinds of communities, there are real differences in what they face, and obviously our history on racism is something very particular. But in economic terms, they have more in common than our politics allows to be expressed, and that we have to find a way of doing something because people are angry in both those communities, and they have a right to be angry.
Well, and so now let's turn to how do we find a way? What do we do next? So where should we go? And Mirka, maybe I'll start with you on that too. What do you see when you look ahead from where you sit, from your perspective, right? What do you see as steps we should take, all of us, or you and your community, or your fellow students, having learned from COVID? Where do we go?
Yeah, I think that one thing that we have to do is recognizing the humanity of all people, right? But I think a challenge is that we are not doing that right now. As a collective of human beings, it's just something that's not going on. We need to think and reflect about the ways that we are currently benefiting from the exploitation of others, and we need to learn to live together in a way that is intentional and beneficial to communities that have been marginalized historically. We also need to learn to share resources to ensure people do not go hungry and that people have access to basic needs. Even though that is the bare minimum, I think that's definitely a baseline. But this is hard when those who have privilege are taking advantage of the disadvantage of others. And I'm gonna give a small anecdote, but I think it tells a lot about our own character as human beings. So during the start of COVID-19, we all saw the memes about the empty shelves of toilet paper. And I remember people who could afford it would buy them in bulk and resell them online at unimaginable prices. Those who could only buy a little at a time, right, were left with no toilet paper, and their only option was to buy it in an upcharge. And so there was like a lack of accessibility. And even though this is a story about toilet paper, I think it can be told about other basic needs and other resources, including food and housing. And so I think one thing we should do is challenge that mindset and challenge these actions that we're taking. And as I said, recognizing the humanity of us as a collective and human beings.
Excellent, thank you.
Amen.
So David, you've been the prophet of doom here tonight. And you've also talked about Catholic social teaching in such a remarkable way as you always do. And in Catholic social teaching, we talk about solidarity not just as a feeling, but as an action, as something we respond to. So when you look ahead, what kind of actions do you think we should be engaging in?
Okay, I'll start with solidarity. I was going to talk about Pope Francis and accompaniment, which is a passion of mine, but I'll go to solidarity. We were running the gamut of all social teaching from one part of Pope Francis to the other part of Pope Francis.
You can do both.
So I'll mention solidarity on 3 levels. The first is on the global level. Mm-hmm. So when the war in Korea broke out in 1950, people sort of had a sense that it had something to do with the contest against totalitarianism, but they didn't really understand it was the first proxy war of the Cold War. And Ukraine can be seen as the first proxy war of the war against authoritarianism, an ideological, economic, technological, and political conflict that will stretch on. And so the first thing we have to do is win that one. And that involves solidarity among the democratic and liberal nations, which I think Joe Biden has led quite well so far, with a few 9-word gaffes here and there. But so you know, the world is decoupling. Foreign direct investment across these 2 spheres is dropping. Trade is dropping. We're going to bring back our own supply chains. So there's this danger of isolation and national isolation. And so fighting this well so we keep firm to our values and have confidence in our system, that centralizing power just doesn't work. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is about this inequality point. Years ago, when EJ first knew me, I was at the Weekly Standard and had just come off the Wall Street Journal editorial page. And, you know, a year ago, I find myself writing, no, we need this $4 trillion Biden spending program. And so why have I gone all wacko Marxist?
Always knew it.
Don't taunt me, EJ. Gonna have a Chris Rock moment here. It's because of the inequality became not only an economic threat and a social threat, but we needed the money to show dignity so that people can live with dignity. And so that's a national level of solidarity. And then I'll say on the most local, I'm very guilty of this, of talking about social connection and community a lot. The real key to solidarity is at the most micro level. How do you treat the person? Do you see the person right in front of you? Or do you not see them? When you're getting drunk with somebody at a bar, not that would happen to me, but if you're a 22-year-old getting drunk with somebody at the bar, do you treat them as if they possess a soul or do you not? And just the tricky things, how do you disagree with respect? How do you forgive with rigor? These are like micro social skills. But it's in the practice of these micro social skills that either somebody feels respected and understood and human, or they feel dehumanized. And sometimes I feel we're in this massive conflict between the forces of humanization and then the forces of dehumanization, which are often political or technological or something. And if Pope Francis talks about the human person, then it's that putting the dignity of the human person at the front. And just to close with accompaniment, a concept that he has spoken about and really introduced the world to, it's an other-centered way of doing normal life together. So we think of a pianist accompanies a singer. The pianist is there to make the singer feel more and sound more beautiful. And we can either go through our life, whether we're shopping together or, I don't know, dropping off kids together, in a spirit of accompaniment, or we can do it in a spirit of our normal self-centeredness. And it's in the small daily gestures of life that we either serve the cause of humanization or dehumanization. And accompaniment is just a nice reminder that we can talk about grand moral theories, but really it's how do you show up for the person you happen to meet at breakfast.
I love his focus on accompaniment. I do think it's one of his most important concepts that he's advancing through his papacy. And I think, Christine, when you focus on that, when you think about how we advance the common good going forward, where do you think we should go? Like, what's some next steps we can take together?
So, one of the main arguments in Rethinking Sex is that we need to be honest, that we need to speak the truth so that we can then have a conversation about how to move forward. It's one thing to sort of identify what the problem is. The next step is to figure out what to do. And to do that, you have to first have said what the problem is. So I think to move forward in the common good, we need to start making truth claims. We need to start making statements about what the common good is. You know, one excellent thing about the Ukraine crisis, not the crisis itself, but our response to it, is exactly what we've said here, that people do realize that this is an existential conflict, that one side is in the right and the other is extremely not. We need to do that for other things. You know, there was an election. We need to say one person won and the other person did not. That is a fact. When it comes to COVID, vaccines work. These other false treatments being touted on the internet do not. That is an actual fact. When it comes to race, there are, in fact, racial inequities, deep-seated, that stem from our country's very founding, and that is something that we need to do something about. When it comes to sex, my current beat, the idea that sex is in fact meaningful and that dehumanization is a bad thing, that certain things are better or worse than others. I think once we've established that there is a truth out there, we then can move forward to seek it in all different areas of our life. And we can argue over, you know, how to best seek it, but we have to have a direction to go in. And I hope that that is something that we're waking up to.
Thanks for that. And how about, we're going to get to questions in just a second, but maybe wrap us up on that. How do we look forward? What should we be focused on as we think about advancing the common good and coming out of what we've been through together?
I think as we look forward, if we do not take away the lesson, one of the great lessons from COVID, and that is, at least initially, how we cared for each other. I mean, I remember standing out at 7 o'clock every night, banging my frying pan to thank the healthcare workers so they could hear it all over Manhattan. That's a wonderful thing. Now we don't do anything. We probably push them away, you know, trying to get our Uber or whatever it is. But I think that is such an important lesson that when we're together, we do better as a country. We still can achieve great things. We achieved the vaccines. We now are facing perhaps the greatest crisis of our time in climate change. We can solve these problems, but we need to do it together. And the only way we do it together is by listening to each other. And that is a skill that I think our society has really lost. And you can see it in, for example, and just because I cover climate change is what I do, I was in Glasgow and I interviewed Lisa Murkowski, who's a Republican senator from Alaska. And they had just passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And I said, well, you know, what about the Build Back Better plan? She said, remember, the infrastructure bill was bipartisan. The Build Back Better plan was Democrats and Democrats only. Her argument is, with something as complex as climate change and something that just can't be done in a year, that it's a long-term project. So if you're going to avoid the climate whiplash that we have endured with Obama and then Trump and then Biden, you need to get both sides together. So you need to listen to each other. And both Democrats and Republicans need to come together to create a plan. And I think that's one thing we have to do, is listen to each other and really listen to each other and stop making everything a zero-sum game.
Absolutely. Now let's listen to you all. It's time for some questions. Sure? Let's listen to EJ. Go ahead.
There are two themes that have really come through that are worth focusing on and thinking about. One is, I'm glad David used the word dignity, and the idea of equal dignity, which is so central to Catholic social thought, is one of the concepts that gives me the most hope for pulling out of this mess. Because I think if you look at our conflicts across racial lines, if you look at our conflicts across class lines, there is a strong feeling and a justified feeling among the people who are marginalized that it is their dignity that is not being respected. What Myrna said about the humanity of all people, what Christine says about sex, what Anne said about respect for the rights of the Ukrainian people to live unmolested from attack, what David says about how people feel isolated. I mean, this is all about human dignity. And I'm really grateful for Anne's last point, because we have a really tough time with the idea that individual rights and autonomy actually depend on solidarity. My rights aren't secure unless I protect your rights. Our society falls apart. My own wealth even is in danger if we create such wide disparities of wealth that everything collapses. That was the insight that led to all of those giant programs during the pandemic. It's unfortunate we didn't help poor people because we were trying to do the right thing, but we did help poor people because we knew if we didn't, the entire structure would collapse. And then those structures disappear. Now, I just really want to say I appreciated Myrna's point about the toilet paper, because it is a weirdly appropriate metaphor for so many shortages in other areas. And everybody in this room is going to remember that metaphor. So thank you for that.
Well, great point, and obviously our focus on dignity and interdependence is central to Catholic social thought. It's central to what we do at the Initiative. We'd love to hear from you all now. So if you have a question, come on up to the microphone in the second, in the middle row, and I'll call on you. I'm going to channel John Carr as if he were here and say, please phrase your question in the form of a question. And let's get started. Please identify yourselves and where you're from, and then if you have someone in particular you'd like to direct your question to, let me know that.
Good evening. My name is James Figatakis. I'm an alum of the School of Foreign Service here. And one of the lasting legacies of Georgetown was the required courses in philosophy and religion here. I come to you because I am working on a documentary called Mission Joy, which is based on the Book of Joy, about the dialogues between Reverend Desmond Tutu and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And everything that you've all said has just been extraordinary and is very much what we are doing in terms of community engagement and individual responsibility, addressing mental health issues and interfaith issues with the documentary Mission Joy, which will be out on Amazon in June. My question is sparked by many things. One, Christine, your reference to freedom and liberty, and one of my questions would be, how can we define responsible and caring freedom and liberty? And also, what is the role of empathy, compassion, and service to others?
Thank you so much. That's great. Christine, could you help us with that? What do you think of as responsible and caring liberty?
So, in my book, in Rethinking Sex, I talk about how consent as a sexual ethic doesn't work because it's essentially contractual. It's a legal agreement that one person can do something to another person. And it brings you to a place where, your highest standard is I'm having sex with somebody and it's not a felony, which is not a great standard. And I propose a better standard for sex in the book that I think is applicable to almost any situation, which is willing the good of the other, which is actually Aristotle by way of Thomas Aquinas. And willing the good of the other means that you care for the other person's good as much as you would care for your own. It also implies that you try and seek out the good and know the good, both in a larger sense and for that other person. And empathy is the baseline there. Care is the baseline there. Thinking about the other person, just keeping them in mind, takes us far further towards, a sense of equality, a sense of freedom that is still boundaried by the good in some way than almost any, ethic that we are practicing currently. I think it goes back to this idea of, human dignity, simply keeping the other in mind when you think of freedom, not just thinking of your own freedom and what it allows you to do, but what effect you're actually having on other people, how you're impinging upon their rights, their happiness, their joy, their ability to live a good and moral life, and keeping that consciousness, front of mind in as many situations as possible.
That's great. It might be a way for us to come together out of COVID, thinking about others more responsibly. Hi, Joe. It's great to see you again. It's great to be back. And you know what I'm going to ask? First, please identify yourself to everybody. But I think let's take 2 questions at a time since we're running close on time, and I want to be sure to get to as many students as we can. So go with your question, and then the gentleman after you, too, as well. Thanks.
My name's Joe Martucci. I'm a former union attorney and parishioner at a local Arlington parish. My question is for Mr. Brooks. You were talking about moral formation, and for whatever reason, the lack of moral formation more recently. As a second-generation Italian immigrant, that was the bedrock of everything we grew up with. What has happened to cause that to go away?
Thanks so much, Joe. How about you? Please identify yourself and let us know where you want to direct your question to.
Sure. Hi, I'm Antonio. I work at the U.S. Department of State. Mirka touched a little bit on this, so I actually want to direct this to other folks on the panel, and that's immigration reform. Everyone kind of hinted at the idea that we know some people suffered more during this pandemic than others. We know some people contributed. The term essential worker was thrown around. Over 5 million essential workers in the United States are undocumented immigrants. That's almost half the undocumented population of the country. I'm hoping the panel can touch on 2 ideas. One, the moral case for immigration reform as opposed to just the economic case. And 2, since we're now some ways into the administration, if you can speak to the question of institutional failure, maybe just institutional capacity. We know what changes need to be done. It's not happening. What does that mean?
And so why don't we say, David, if you could take that first question that Joe posed about sort of what happened to the bedrock beliefs that we shared, and maybe EJ, you could talk about the immigration reform question. Go ahead.
Well, moral formation, you have to think you need to be formed. And so if you grow up with any biblical ethic, you grow up with the concept of sin and original sin. And now the word sin has gone out of fashion except in relation to desserts. And so it used to be you thought, well, part of your life mission and calling was to improve yourself, to improve your soul, to make yourself a little more sanctified, a little less degraded. And entire educational institutions were built around this concept. There was a guy at the Stowe School, which is a prep school up in New England, who said, our job is to turn out students who are acceptable at a dance, invaluable at a shipwreck. And so that means that when the chips are down, that person will show up. Around about 1955, that ethos that we're gloriously made but deeply broken, that went away from the culture, for the center of the culture. And we had psychologists like Carl Rogers and others, and the self-esteem movement, the self-actualization movement, that said deep down we're deeply good, and society is what's corrupting us. And if you think deep down you have a little angel inside yourself, then there's no need for moral formation because you're good. And there's a saying, culture catechizes, and that cultural belief swept into the churches. It produced a phenomenon my colleague Ross Douthat called bad religion. And so it's a false view of human nature that we're all just wonderful inside and don't need formation. I think that would be my explanation.
Thanks for that. EJ, immigration reform in 2 minutes.
Yeah, good luck. How about sort of 7 years of moving backwards? I mean, that is really what's happened to us as a country on immigration reform, that immigration reform was once a bipartisan cause. And I think you can actually trace there are a lot of places you can trace the beginning of Trumpism, but one of them was when the immigration reform bill that President Bush proposed was defeated by Republicans in the Senate. And it was defeated by talk radio. A prominent senator said we had to delay it so that Rush Limbaugh could explain to people what was in the bill. And that was a sort of beginning of a kind of backlash against immigration that swept much of the Republican Party, and the parts of the party that had historically been pro-immigration reform for business reasons were kind of marginalized, and it created a fear, I think, in significant parts of the Democratic Party to move forward. And then the pandemic closed us in. We wanted to keep people out to protect us from the virus. My view of America is we eventually always get around to it, because at some point we realize that for moral reasons, as the gentleman suggested, we have all kinds of people here who are living by the rules, working hard, not breaking the law, paying taxes and not getting anything for them, by the way. So it makes sense to legalize their status. And in the end, we've always hit a point where we said, no, we want to be a bigger country, we need more people, and we will take immigrants. But we're taking about the most circuitous path to get there that I can imagine right now.
Absolutely. All right, you know what I'm going to ask? I'm going to ask everybody here just a quick question, very quickly. Identify who you are, say your question in as short a way as you can, and then we're just going to go around the panel and everybody respond as you will in a quick answer as we wrap up here. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Riccio. I'm a freshman in the SFS. Quickly, I wanted to thank you guys for the great roundtable discussion here tonight. But my question, based off of some of the things both David and Ann brought up about dignity and also the statistics you cited showing the sort of lack of respect of dignity of both ourselves and of others, without a sort of pandemic like COVID-19 or a threat of evil like Ukraine, what steps can we take to kind of return to a level of dignity that seemingly you guys have all discussed has disappeared over the last, I think you said 20 or so years, but I think it's been representative over the last few years, especially with COVID-19, with the rise of Trumpism and the social divides. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that. Hi, Dominic. What's your question?
Hi, I'm Dominic. I'm a third-year undergrad student. And one of the key moments of the past 2 years for me was the release of Fratelli Tutti and giving context what Pope Francis calls a culture of encounter. And so, David, you talked about solidarity at 3 levels, and I was wondering if you thought culture of encounter has a role here, and if so, how it plays in at the 3 levels.
Thanks so much.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. My name is Emma Bradley. I'm a senior in the School of Foreign Service undergraduate and studying culture and politics and diplomacy. Christine, you mentioned having conversations with people, and when there is a common understanding that there is a truth, then being able to dialogue and debate based on that. But my question for you, and perhaps for Mr. Brooks as well, is what advice would you have for people when maybe in this postmodern society you're having a conversation with someone where maybe there isn't that shared understanding, and that there's just sort of this idea of just subjectivity and like sort of endless problematization. What advice would you have for sort of a grounding and an anchoring? And thank you all so much for being here.
Great question. Thanks. And one more.
I'm short, sorry. Hi, my name is Arias Benitez. I'm a senior in the college here at Georgetown. And my question is directly to Mirka. Thank you for all the work that you do here on campus, specifically because we are at a predominantly white institution and you work with the communities that are often ignored in the DC area. So thank you for that. But my question is, how can we as young people who are usually the ones on the ground doing this work, how can we take care of ourselves? What are some things that we can do, and what are some things that older people can do for us to help us out a little bit more? Thank you so much for
What a terrific question. Thanks so much. And here's maybe how we'll handle this as we're wrapping up. We've talked about how we can, America, I'm going to start with you and answer that great question. And then we'll go around. We talked about dignity. We talked about Fratelli Tutti. We talked about advice for people who don't share fundamental beliefs. Maybe we'll just go around the horn after that and wrap ourselves up. So go ahead, Mirka.
Yeah, so I do want to say that when you are doing this type of work, it does become very hard. As someone who does work that directly relates to myself and my own identities, sometimes it can become triggering. Sometimes you just have to take a step back. When I was talking to Border Patrol, that conversation was honestly one of the worst experiences I've ever had in my life. And you just have to set your own boundaries, take a step back, and recognize that burnout is very real. And sometimes you just need a nap, Yeah. Or sometimes, I know I'm a college student, so sometimes I just need to watch Netflix. I need my favorite meal or my favorite snack. And I think if we are constantly thinking about our work, we can eventually burn out and not just completely shut down and quit, and that's not the point of the work. The point of the work is to do it in an adequate manner in which you are healthy, so you are able to build your community and also make more substantial change.
Excellent. Respect your own dignity. EJ, you have an answer to one of these questions that were brought up?
I'm thinking about this. I guess I'm obsessed with the question of dignity and how can we square the optimism and the pessimism, or the hopefulness and the sadness that we're seeing here. And I'm grateful that somebody brought up Fratelli Tutti, which is really a great document worth reading. I come back, as my friend David does a lot, to Reinhold Niebuhr. And what's been bumping through my head is Niebuhr's old line, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. Man's capacity for injustice makes democracy necessary. And I've always liked that line because the man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible is we can aspire to a world in which we understand that if we don't prosper together, we're all going to fall eventually, and that we can protect each other's rights. But as, again, the reference to Ukraine shows, our capacity for injustice means we really do want leadership limited by the will of the people. We do not want authoritarian leadership. And I think the trick of Christianity at its best is that it allows us to marry the aspirations, the hopes we have with a very realistic view of what we flawed human beings can do to others and to our world. And I just want to close by saying that I am really grateful, Mariner, to you for your voice here, not just because you're a student and a young person, which is very cool on a panel of older people, especially like me, but also because of your just deep feeling for the people who've been marginalized. And I think you brought their voice here tonight in such a powerful way, and thank you.
Thanks for giving us the chance to do that, EJ. David, what do you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I'll try to wrap up dignity, encounter, and not shared understanding. And these are things that are not abstract and large, they're small. How many times have you left a party and thought, you know, no one asked me a question? And if you want to make somebody feel dignified, just ask them a question and have a good conversation. And so just knowing the skills of how to have a good conversation, like one is be a loud listener. I have a buddy who, when you talk to him, it's like he's in a charismatic church. He's going, yeah, preach, preach. I just love talking to that guy because he is a loud listener. Another tip is make them authors, not witnesses. When people tell you stories, they never go into enough detail. So if you ask them a question about detail, then they begin narrating what actually happened. Where was your boss standing when he said that? And then if you find yourself disagreement, there's an old Jewish tradition, find the disagreement under the disagreement. Yeah. So we are disagreeing, but there's actually a philosophical reason why we're disagreeing. Let's explore for that. And that makes it fun and not as hostile. Keep the gem statement in the center. If you disagree with somebody, there's probably something you agree upon at the core. So for example, if my brother and I are arguing about my dad's health care, we may disagree about the health care, but we both want what's best for our father. And so that's the gem statement. That's how you keep relationships intact in the midst of disagreement. And then finally, the quality of your conversation depends on the quality of your questions. So if you ask big, good questions, I collect some good questions like, what forgiveness are you withholding? You can ask somebody that. So you have not forgiven somebody. Tell me about that. A friend of mine was at a job interview, and at the end of the interview, he was being interviewed. He asked the interviewer, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And she started crying because she wouldn't be doing HR at that company if she wasn't afraid.
Did he get the job?
He didn't get the job, of course not.
Don't ask that.
Yeah. But so anyway, like a big question that gets people to step back from their lives and think about it. That's how you have good conversations. That's how you make people, they go away thinking, wow, I feel respected. I feel listened to.
Thanks so much. How about you, Christine?
Well, I'm still thinking about when you should ask somebody who they have neglected to forgive. Probably like at the end of the party,
Yeah,
like
it's not
later,
your open. It's not
later
your
in the
lead.
evening.
First date question.
But to the question of how to talk to somebody about what truth looks like and what truth is when you don't necessarily share the same starting points, I think that all of those sort of conversational helpers are actually really key. Catholicism and Catholics frequently appeal to sort of natural law, the understanding that there are intuitions that we can, look to when we are trying to define what is real and what the truth is. And I found in my interviews for Rethinking Sex and in many conversations about many different topics, it is asking people about their experience, making them authors and not witnesses, where you can kind of find a kernel of like, what is really going on here? What can we actually agree on? You ask someone, say, about an encounter that they've had, a bad sexual encounter, which I unfortunately had to ask people about a lot. And by getting them to explain their story, by allowing them to add their details, to sort of think through aloud with you something that happened to them, you can get to key kernels of truth. What did you want this encounter to look like? What does the good look like to you? Your understanding of the good has something in common with mine. Where do we go from there? I think that you have to meet people where they are and, not to harp on the one word that we've hit on again and again, but treating people as humans with dignity whose ideas matter, even if they aren't necessarily or immediately the same as yours, is a way to, I think, bring us all together and bring the conversation forward.
So Anne, we've heard a lot here tonight. What do you want to leave us with? You get the last word.
Well, I think what Christine said is all about a culture of encounter. I mean, it is easy to dislike somebody if you don't know them. But if you encounter them, as Pope Francis has urged us all to do, and you talk to them, as David suggests, and you ask good questions, you learn something about, it's really hard to walk away from someone at that moment. And that gets to everything from the questions of immigration to how we do things. If we know each other, then we will have more compassion for each other. And I would leave you with the challenge that Pope Francis gave all of us in his book, Let Us Dream, about the COVID crisis. And he said that this was our Noah moment. It was our chance to reset, to think again, to think better about how we live, to throw away this, get rid of this virus of indifference and start to care for each other. And I hope that it's not too late to do that. And I hope that is what we take from this experience.
Thank you so much for that. And thank all of you for joining us here in person tonight. Before we go, I want to thank those of you who joined us online, and especially those of you who are joining us from C-SPAN. This dialogue's been recorded. It'll be posted at our site, so please feel free to go there and check out the other resources we have at our site. I want to say a special thanks to my colleague, Anna Gordon, who is the person who makes all of this work. We had a lot of other Georgetown colleagues helping us here today, and a number of students as well, our students, so thanks very much to them. In particular, I want to say a special thanks to my co-director, John Carr, who truly has been thinking about this conversation since September. He's been eager to do it since then, and he has been working on this for a long time. And he told me to tell you to go out there to the reception and have a slider in his honor, so please do that. You're going to see him on Thursday. We have a terrific dialogue on Thursday of this week at 12:30, and it's online, and I encourage you. It's on Ukraine. It's on the invasion of Ukraine. And we have Cardinal Michael Czerny, who's been sent to the Ukraine region twice by Pope Francis to represent the church there. We have Archbishop Boris Gudziak, who's the leader of Ukrainian Catholics here in the United States and has spent years and years in Ukraine. We have Jerry O'Connell, who reports on these issues from the Vatican and whose wife is in Ukraine reporting right now. He's terrific, right? Fabulous. Tatiana Stevnici, who is the head of Caritas Internationalis in Ukraine. She will be talking with us from Ukraine. That's sort of the Catholic Charities of the region, right? And she'll be talking to us about their work there. And then we have Lori Johnston, who's a wonderful theologian who thinks about war and peacemaking. And John will be moderating that conversation. So please join us. You can RSVP at our site. We'll also be hosting a dialogue on Sister Thea Bowman coming up. And we hope all of you here will join us in the second floor hallway of Healy Hall. So it's just one flight down for our reception. Finally, please join me in thanking our wonderful panel, E.J. Dionne, Rick Sosa, and Christine and David.